Okay, let's get rocking and rolling here. A few items of info business. Not that you were looking for it, but we had a camera malfunction 2 classes ago, and then we thought we had it figured out, and then it did the same thing last week. So none of the last 2 on immigration got recorded. So we'll be getting the camera down for repair, I guess, or whatever. So that's just an FYI. We will, when we come back after the first of the year, do one more session on the immigration thing, but we're going to focus on the southern border, or the Hispanic, Latino side of things. And we'll have some conversation about that. I wondered about that, but I've had like 3 or 4 people really interested in that really want it, and I had said we were going to talk about it, so we didn't get to it. After that, we have some other subjects on the agenda. I would love to hear via email from you or a phone call or something. I do have some concerns about how this is going over and how you're feeling about it. So if you're feeling positive, negative, ambivalent, whatever, I appreciate any feedback with that. So as far as taking on some of the social issues, because the other thought I had is we should just do one once in a while rather than just hit them all at once. So I'm pondering and discerning. So give me some help in that if you'd like. So today we are going to pause from the whole public church theme that we've had this last month or so, and just look at the Christmas story. It's always really good to listen to and go back to the Christmas story every year and do some study and do some teaching on it, and then have some conversation about what strikes you. So we are actually, let's see. I think that that's right, this didn't work last week. So we're going to look at Luke's Christmas first, and then we'll look at, if we have time, we'll look at Matthew's, and then we'll do a little bit of teaching about the origin of the celebration of Christmas in the life of the church. We're not going to do 2,000 years or 1,700 years of history, but we'll go back and see if we can see when it first got started. So we're going to look at Luke here and just kind of walk through his story and hear from you with what strikes you. So we'll read it through, and then I'll come back and I'm just going to make some comments, and then we'll have some conversation about it. And this by way of helping you appreciate its reading on Christmas Eve. So this is from Luke. Well, let's say a prayer first. Gracious and loving God, as we study your word given to us about the incarnation, about the Kairos event of your coming into this world, and your birth into this world from Mary, God, give us your guidance and let this time be fruitful and helpful for our faith. In Jesus' name, amen. So I'm just going to read it through and then come back. Well, we don't need to read all through. You're so familiar with it. We'll just start talking. In those days, a decree went out from Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. So Emperor Augustus was a very important Caesar in the life of Rome. Luke tells us about him, I believe, because Luke wants to ground the event of the birth of Christ and the whole event of Christ in history. I remember my college class on the Gospels, and I think the chapter on Luke was the Gospel in history, or something to that effect. Luke wants us to know that this happened at a certain point in time. It's a historical event. It's not made up. It's grounded in history. Now, with that comes the first problem, that all the world should be registered. We have no historical knowledge that Augustus ever did a whole world registration. Now there's lots of ways of explaining this, however. There were local registrations, local censuses. Isn't that what we call it? Census? Yeah. So we know that they happened more locally than the whole world, and so there's ways to explain why Luke, for the people there, it might have been the whole world, for all the countryside, and there's different ways you can play with the translation. We don't need to get too worried about that, but we do know that these registrations did happen, and they were for the purpose of what?
Taxation.
Taxation. We do it for that reason now? I think so. And like who gets how many representatives and in our system of government and whatnot. So notice that the birth of God Almighty, God the Son, into the world, the second person of the Trinity, happens in the midst of worldly concerns of taxation. And in this day it wasn't representation, but it was definitely taxation. And so you might wonder, well, what kind of taxation was going on in first century? Well, there was taxing from Rome. There was some of that, but then also at this time, if you lived in and around Jerusalem, there was huge taxes, the temple tax, to support the sacrifices and the priests and the whole system of governance and worship around the temple. I think Professor Oakman at POU in his book, Jesus at the Time of Palestine, estimated from his research that at least 80% of the economy of Jerusalem came from the temple. So, that's bigger than the, Bangor and Shipyard, here in Silverdale. It was the market of the area. So this was the first registration that was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. We know this guy existed. We start to play with, we know from historical sources that he served during these times, and so we try and place, exactly when Jesus was born. But I don't think Luke is interested in, figuring out the exact day or time. What he's interested in is that it happened in history, during the reign of these folks, of Augustus and Quirinius. So all went to their towns to be registered. So of course that sets up the sojourn to Bethlehem. Joseph also went from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David called Bethlehem. So the city of David actually primarily was known as well. Is it Bethlehem? There's another city that you know very well. Jerusalem, right. But Bethlehem's really close to Jerusalem. And Bethlehem, probably, when we think of a city, we think of, was it like Silverdale? Think about, how many of you grew up in a small town in North Dakota that had about 100 people in it? Okay, well that's what Bethlehem was in Jesus' day. So it wasn't a massive metropolitan place. It was what we would think about as a small town. But again, from the historical stuff I've read, that's the estimations of what it would be like. So also Bethlehem, the city of David, because of the tribe of the various tribes that were there, it was totally understandable that Bethlehem would be called the city of David, or Bethlehem would be connected to David because of the tribe and the family. So that's all good, even though Jerusalem, is probably primarily known as the city of David. So off to Bethlehem, this little town they go, because he was descended from the house and family of David. So Joseph is in line. This is Luke's way to say that Joseph, on his side, is in line with the king of Israel. And if you remember your Old Testament, God said that of David's throne there would always be a king. There would be a kingdom forever. And of course that became a huge crisis when they got shipped off into Babylon, and even though there kind of was a king, you know, there's a big crisis about that, and so the gospel writers of Matthew and Luke especially want us to see that God hasn't forgotten them. But this isn't a human king now. This is God, the second person of the Trinity, coming into the world. And all Luke says...
Joseph is his stepfather, not
yes.
his real father.
Well, he's not his biological father. That's correct. Yeah. But he is married. He's betrothed. Well, we'll get to that. Yes, Kim, were you going to...
Oh, no, I'm waiting to stop.
Oh, wait a minute there. Okay. Oh, you got to say something now. So yes, that's a way to think about it, Bob. He went to be registered with Mary, whom he was engaged and who was expecting a child. So that's a lot said right there. So the New Revised Standards translation of this word in Greek as engaged is probably misleading. It's probably not the best translation because we think of what it means to be engaged today. But in Jesus' day, you didn't pick who you got married to. That was chosen, that was a family thing. And you might be engaged to someone for years and years, or betrothed, because, these two families, your son is going to marry my daughter, and they make that decision a long time. But so there aren't marital relations that are supposed to happen during this time, however. They're not married yet, they are betrothed. You're going to get married to this person, and it was a community, family decision, an event. So she was set up to marry Joseph, but whoa, wait a minute, speed bump, she was expecting a child. Of course, we have heard in the narrative of Luke that this child is of the Holy Spirit, and so we understand why, but folks around them certainly would be, it would be a major problem. So, for Joseph in particular, and Matthew picks up on Joseph's side of it. And Luke just simply tells us they were betrothed, engaged, and Mary was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for her to deliver her child. So they traveled to Bethlehem. Did it say how they got there? How'd they get there? Oh, I'm sure she had a donkey. She must have. Yeah, the donkey isn't in the gospel readings. That's been a tradition. But you know what? That makes sense to me that Mary would, getting close to, and that would probably move the child along too. Like a long walk to get labor and going, and sure a ride on a donkey would do something too. So. But we get a sense here that they got there in plenty of time. Or maybe just in time. While they were there, the time came for her to deliver a child. So we don't know if they took off the 6th month or the, halfway through the pregnancy or whatever. But they got there and the time to deliver her child came. And she gave birth to her firstborn son. This word firstborn has been hotly debated amongst Protestant and Catholics. Why do you think?
She was a
virgin.
Did Jesus have any brothers afterwards?
Yes, exactly. Because the Catholic Church looks at only born. Because some of their doctrines that it's important to them that Jesus, Mary only gave birth to Jesus. The Protestants are, it doesn't matter type of thing. It matters is that this firstborn child was born of the Holy Spirit. There's no reason to think why she couldn't have other children. And then, of course, Protestants say, well, it talks about James being the brother of Jesus. But then, there's different debates and all that. And to me, it makes absolutely no difference. But for our brothers and sisters in the Roman Catholic Church, that's an important thing. Literally, the Greek word here is prototokos, which means firstborn. That's literally, firstborn is literally its meaning. But again, people debate debate it and whatnot. So she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in bands of cloth. So this is interesting. This is one word in Greek. Well, let me just show it to you this way. Take a second to... Maybe I won't show you. Because it's pulling up my interlinear. Okay, so you see all these little arrows here? This is an interlinear, so it really helps you. It's a real great cheat sheet for Greek and English. So it puts the English word, the Greek word here, right underneath the actual translated English word. So you can see wrapped him in bands of cloth all come from these two words, and this is the word for him. So wrapped him up in cloth. Now, so if I were to, let's see what word it'll, and do a quick word study on that, you'll see, what does this tell you? What this tells you is that this is there's only a couple places where that word is used in the New Testament. If it was used a bunch of different places, it'd look like that one, because the English translators will not always use the same English word to translate the same Greek word, because it depends on, the context and all the different workings of the word and whatnot. So, but here we can see that this word, this wrapped him in bands of cloth, doesn't occur much. And yes, Billie Jean, you have your...
It just occurred to me like birth and death. And so at the crucifixion, is that same wrapped in bands of cloth used?
So this is where commentators get really excited, because they want, and I have read some things that kind of got me interested, that maybe there's some connections here, that the that this is a foreshadowing of, the burial clothes, this type of thing. However, from what I've read about births in first century, this was what they did. We still kind of do that. Don't we wrap up a newborn infant pretty tight? Now, I know some cultures actually do it way too tight. I was listening to Amanda, I think that was from her presentation last week from Tanzania, that part of the health workers were like, you're maybe even injuring your child doing this tradition. But nonetheless, you wrap the child up, you keep them all bundled up and warm, and so they had these strips of cloth. This also, though, says something about the economic stature of this household. It certainly would be absolutely kind of average or even lower income, that they don't have, that what they've got to use are these bands of cloth. And then laid him in a manger. Now this is a good translation of the Greek word. It is a feeding trough. It's actually what it means, because there was no place for them in the inn. Now this is the phrase here that has probably shaped Western views of the birth of Christ more than any other. Because typically in our nativities, where do we put? We've got a stable out on a hill somewhere, right? And it's a beautiful scene, and there's nothing wrong with that. But when we think of the word inn, we think of what? The Holiday Inn, right? I mean, there's no place, there to stay, so we had to stay in the Holiday Inn. Well, think Bethlehem's not a big place, okay? And then you also have to wonder, so a Middle Eastern person hearing this would go, that would never happen. There's no way my kin comes to town and there's no place for them. That would be about the worst, think of the worst faux pas, the worst shameful thing you could do. It's almost that bad.
But they weren't married.
No, they weren't married, but they were betrothed. They were betrothed, so they're together. So So it would be a big deal. Now some people have possibly wondered, well, maybe his family rejected him because she was pregnant, they weren't married yet. We get no indication of that. But here's the, so then we start with that and go, is that what this inn is? So let's do a word search on that. The actual word gets translated this way in the New Revised Standard Version. Can you see that? Let's see if I can go a little bit bigger. No, it's not letting me make it bigger here. But nonetheless, so we'll go around and look at these. So this translation of no place for them in the inn is only in Luke. This particular Greek word is only translated in this Luke Christmas story. It can also be guest, or lodging, or room. So let me just click on some of these. So lodging, this comes from some intertestamental books, where this same exact word is translated as, it was a lodging place for the Gentiles, occupies an excellent lodging place. So that gives it, that has more of the sense of like the Holiday Inn, like there was a separate lodging place. If we go here, room, in Mark, and in, I believe it's also in Matthew, and whenever he enters, say to the owner of the house, the teacher asks, where is my guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? Remember when Jesus came into Jerusalem and the triumphant entry has happened and they need a place to have the Passover? Well, the word used when Jesus says, I need a place to celebrate it, is a guest room, a special room. Not necessarily a hotel, but a room. So, I just mentioned that this one is the Luke 2:7. It's the only place that it's translated as an inn. So with knowing Middle Eastern culture, knowing how the word is typically used, most scholars want us to realize that this was probably a guest room. There was no place in the guest room for them. Why would that be? You got a lot of family coming, right? Grandma and Grandpa are coming. And they need a place to stay, right? Come on, Grandma and Grandpas, right? When we bought our house, we made sure there was a separate bedroom so my mom could visit, you know? So we do this, right? We want to have a place for guests. Well, first century folks did that. Let's see if I can find, let's see here, right here, maybe, hopefully you can get it, yes. So I'll pull up here one depiction of, and I think I can make this one bigger, so let's see. One depiction of a first century house. What my reading is, archaeologically, that the average, which was, an average person would have been a very low income. Folks would have their space, they would have a guest space for family and for hospitality, and then in the back of the house, this depiction has it kind of close to the kitchen, but they would have their animals. The point here is they have their animals inside their house. Why would you do that? Warm. And safe. You don't have big corrals to have, you know, people, they were very poor, of low, you know, income. So very likely, and again, I hope this doesn't mess up your image of Christmas. Actually makes it better for me. Very likely, when Joseph and Mary got to Joseph's family, they were told, we're full up in our guest room, we're packed, we have Grandma and Grandpa and Uncle Judy and Aunt, you know, or whatever, and we are packed, and they would be like, well, we'll stay with the kids, stay with the animals. By the way, it's really warm. Probably doesn't. But they didn't. That probably didn't even bother them. You know, when you live next to a dairy farm with all the cows long enough, you don't really smell it. Well, that's not true. I did that. anyway, so it's very likely that when we think about Joseph and Mary and where Jesus was born, that he was born in kind of the barn or the part of the house where the animals were kept, where there was feeding troughs and it was warm. And all there was were bands of cloth to wrap the baby Jesus, and he was laid in a manger, laid in a feeding trough. So that's what Luke wants to tell us about the first part of the Christmas story. I want to pause and get your any questions, or how does this help, or how does it challenge, or yeah.
Two things. The firstborn part, is that essential to him being able to inherit his father's kingdom eventually?
So Kevin's question was, the firstborn thing essential when it comes to him inheriting his father's kingdom? That's interesting, Kevin, because it's good to be reminded that the firstborn got double the inheritance in Jesus' day. It wasn't split evenly. So how many are firstborn folks here? Sorry, you're not in the first century anymore. So the firstborn got double. So there is a sense of that. So I think that's a good thing to hold up. Yeah.
The other thing is, did the concept of inns and taverns even exist then?
Did the concept of inns and taverns? Well, there were taverns, but they weren't places you went to stay. Again, that's what I've learned from some of my reading, is that typically they weren't like, well, honey, we need to find a place to stay, so that's not where you would go. And again, that whole sense of hospitality in Middle Eastern culture, just, a Middle Eastern person and people that stay and live there read this and they say, there's no way you would allow your, when my family comes to visit, that's what they get a hotel, that's what they want to do. It's no big deal if we don't have enough room or whatever. But in this day, so there were taverns, but you don't get the sense that there were a lot of, especially in Little Bethlehem, because it was just a little town. So, great question. Now how does this, let me ask this question. What do you think Luke's trying to do as he tells us this Christmas story? And he tells us details about being born, laid in a manger, wrapped in bands of cloth. We haven't even got to the shepherds yet, which we'll go to next. But what do you think he's trying to do? Yeah.
It's ordinary.
Ordinary.
Yeah.
Yes.
I would have said humble.
Humble.
It's not a royal, like the king of
Right.
Israel or king of Egypt.
Right. Absolutely. I think that's huge.
Maybe even poor,
And poor, yeah. And I think that would be
even by their standards.
by their standards, from what we hear, it would seem like Jesus was in the lower end of things. They had upper and lower, and that, and you didn't move around either. So whatever lot you were born into is what you had to stay. So yeah, please.
And then some of it had to do with the prophecy as well, right?
Yes.
So he's actually writing about that prophecy.
Yeah, and Luke, some people say that we're all focused on Matthew as the one who's concerned that prophecy be fulfilled, but Luke ties it in very well to the Old Testament. So yeah, he's definitely concerned to show, this Joseph had the right lineage. We're tying in to King David. All right, good. Anything else you want to highlight? I think the ordinary part of it is really powerful, or the humility part is very important. So let's go on and read about the shepherds. In that region, there were shepherds living in the fields. So a lot of people want to go research, well, who were the shepherds back then? What were they like? Some of what I read says that shepherds, there's some texts, I don't know if it's from Josephus, I'm forgetting now, that talk about shepherds were not, held in the highest esteem. Shifty, not to be trusted. What's that?
They were the homies.
They were the homies. Right. It'll make sense when you hear Pastor Paul's sermon. But the thing that you have to bring alongside that, though, going back, Don, to your comment about fulfilling, biblical thoughts, is that the Old Testament is filled with rich imagery of God as the shepherd and God's king as the shepherd and the whole concept of shepherding. So I think we have to hold that up with this too. If I think about this psalm, he chose his servant David and took him from the sheepfolds, from tending and nursing ewes. He brought him to be the shepherd of his people, Jacob, of Israel, his inheritance. So it's interesting that, Jesus, the people that are told about this first are shepherds. So it kind of has a dual thing. It connects us to the Old Testament concept of Jesus being the good shepherd, and also, though, back to the humility part, right? These are not, the upper folks. These are folks that, at least in my reading, that were not held in the highest regard by any means. In fact, some writings talk about them as being, crooked and this type of thing. But I think we have to take all of that with a grain of salt. Yes, please.
I was going to say,
It wasn't like they searched out the first people to tell about it, and they said, oh, there's the shepherds, let's tell them. But they were there.
They
were
were there.
the first people there to see and know it. It wasn't like, you just said the shepherds were the first to be told. Well, it wasn't like they said, well, let's go find the shepherds and tell them.
Well,
They were there,
they were there, but it's
because that's where they were.
Yeah, but it's pretty intentional that why did the angel go to shepherds? That's well, many a sermon has been preached on that question. Why did God go to the shepherds? So no, but that's helpful to bring that up. Yeah.
When they were in exile, did they have the upper and lower, or did they have to reestablish that after they escaped from Egypt?
Well, after they escaped from Babylon.
Yes.
So that is a great question. I don't know about Babylon. You don't get the sense of that, but you do get the sense that by the time of Jesus, there is this stratification that's happened mostly because of the temple and then the Roman culture. So in the temple you had the priests and the educated and the Pharisees, the teachers, and they were at a certain stature, but even they, as far as the Roman world, were not, in the upper echelons. They were, but then the peasants would be down below them. So I think that's something that more develops when they come back into the land. Now, was it there before the exile? That's a great question too. That's a great question too. What does Mary say in her Magnificat? Let's see here. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away. Luke has if you look at when Jesus does the Sermon on the Mount in Luke, it's not a Sermon on the Mount. It's a Sermon on the Plain. It says he came down to a level place, and then he does this teaching that's pretty much the same in Matthew, or very similar. Now, he may have given the sermon in two different places. I'm sure he did. I preach the same one. No, I'm just kidding. But Matthew, Jesus is on the mountain like Moses, or Jesus is God and the disciples are Moses. I think that's more of what's going on there. But in Luke, everybody gets put on the same plane. The valleys are brought up, the hills are brought low. The Sermon on the Plain. Here, the rich are brought down and the poor are lifted up. So Luke puts everybody, it seems, on the same plane, and that's what clearly, he saw happening as he researched his gospel. And so he tells us these great stories that lift this up. So I think, from what I've read, by the time of Jesus, that stratification was pretty set. What I've read most on is that everything was influenced by a patron-client relationship. Patron, up here higher, would gain the allegiance of clients, and the clients would promise allegiance if the patron would do and take care of them, because they have more power, so they take care of the client, so the client gives loyalty to the patron, and then, but of course,